Hello and welcome to another episode of the G.I. Joe New News Review. I am David Allen. This interview was originally planned for 3D Joes, but due to unforeseen circumstances, the interview will now be presented here instead for your viewing pleasure. I hope you enjoy. Hello, welcome to an interview with Chuck Dixon on 3D Joes. I am David Allen. A little bit about 3D Joes. It is the repository of all things G.I. Joe, creator profiles, the art of G.I. Joe, toy turnarounds, the creation of the toy, comic book interviews, comic book information, anything that you can think of that is part of the G.I. Joe brand. 3D Joes has it for you. So today I am joined by the prolific comic book author Chuck Dixon, who's been writing comics since the early 80s, and he wrote the G.I. Joe comics for Devil's Due and IDW for approximately 15 years or so. And so thank you for joining me today, Chuck.
No, thanks for having me. This should be fun.
So I want to go into a little bit about your background. I'm going to read off some notes that I took about you, and you can correct me if any of this stuff is incorrect. And I'm sure some of it might be incorrect. I hope it's not, but
okay. Well, you've got it off the internet. Chances are some of it's going to be wrong.
It's just the way life is, right?
It is.
So I guess you were born in 1954.
Yes, I was.
In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
You went to school in Philadelphia and Upper Darby, where you graduated in 1972.
Yep.
Okay, so we're good.
Yep.
So
we're good.
So your early work, you worked for First Comics 1984 doing Evangeline.
Yeah.
And then I guess Larry Hama got you in his sights and hired you for Savage Sword of Conan and then Savage Tales. Is that accurate?
Yeah, Savage Tales was first, and then he gave me the Cull the Conqueror backups in Savage Sword to start with.
So you have a connection to Larry Hama going back 40 years.
Oh yeah, yeah, going way back.
And then you worked at Eclipse Comics, 1986. You did Airboy and you did Strike with Tom Lyle.
Yep.
In 1987, you worked on Valkyrie with Paul Gulacy, which is your first work with him that will come back to haunt you later.
Oh, G.I. Joe, yeah.
Then after that, it was Epic Comics. You did Carl Potts' Alien Legion. That's where you first came to my attention because I love Alien Legion, and I got those signed by you many years ago. Then you worked on the Hobbit adaptation, Tolkien's Hobbit, through Eclipse in 1989 to 1990. Then on to Marvel proper with Moon Knight and Punisher Kingdom Gone graphic novel, and then Punisher War Journal.
Right.
And then it gets really hectic for you in the 90s when you joined DC Comics and you got your start with Robin, the Tim Drake Robin, which I consider is my favorite Robin, and that's my Robin. Everybody has a different, version of Batman or Robin or Spider-Man, but that's my version of Robin, Tim Drake. And you worked with Tom Lyle on that.
Yep.
Denny O'Neil hired you for that project, I believe. There was also 2 sequels, Joker's Wild, Cry for the Huntress, and then you went on to do Detective Comics, and you did Detective Comics for almost 100 issues. 644 to 738, I believe, was your run on Detective Comics. You worked on stories such as Nightfall, Contagion, No Man's Land, and you created iconic characters for Batman's continuity, Bane and Stephanie Brown, who is still being used today, and she's going to be in a new TV series. And you are considered the most prolific writer in comics during the 90s because you were writing Detective Comics, Nightwing, Batgirl, Green Arrow, Catwoman. You created Birds of Prey, even though the title Birds of Prey was an extreme comic miniseries that they were going to do, but never got published.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
They had the title Birds of Prey prior to you using it in DC Comics.
Huh.
Maybe that's why they didn't do it. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
And then you moved to Florida, my hometown, Florida, and you got to work at CrossGen Comics.
Yep.
You did Sojourn, you did Sigil, Way of the Rat, El Cazador. And by this point, you were doing 7 books a month, according to my information. That's a lot of comics a month.
There were times, yeah.
David was a prolific writer, but you beat him by 3 or 4 books.
Who?
Peter David.
Oh, no. I leave Peter David in the dust.
Yeah. Well, for a while though, he was writing a lot of stuff at Marvel, but yeah.
But page count and I just 35 years of doing nothing but writing comics and no pauses. Yeah, he's I beat everybody, but he's further down the list. So nothing against Peter, he just didn't write as many comics as I did.
Well, yeah, you in the 90s you blew him out of the water.
Yeah.
So he has very, very long runs on certain series, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, but some of those runs I did fill-ins on.
So then you've worked for a few other publishers after DC. You did work for Moonstone, Bongo, Image, Wildstorm, and Extreme. You worked at Arkhaven, I believe.
Still do.
Oh, still do.
Yeah, digital comics.
Oh, yeah. And Zenoscope. Then 2014, you were given the Inkpot Award. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. It was a big surprise. So,
so now you are writing prose novels, Bad
Times.
Bad Times, and
Leave on Cade. Leave on Cade, yeah.
For audio and Kindle, I believe.
Kindle, print, and audio. Yeah, Levon's on audio. The rest aren't. So I've written about 36 novels all told. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's a lot. You've been busy.
Whew. Yeah, I wasn't getting enough comic book work, so I had to write something.
Gotta keep your home afloat, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So in 2004, you worked at Devil's Due. You got to kind of fill in for the G.I. Joe Reloaded at the end of that run. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
10. And that was kind of like a alternate universe kind of thing where G.I. Joe and Cobras weren't exactly what we expected them to be for that series. And I knew all these years prior to this that you were a big military buff. You like military things and weapons and stuff like that.
Right.
Was that something that led you into G.I. Joe? Was it like something you enjoyed?
Well, I think my relationship. Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly enjoy it. I mean, it's my area of interest lends itself to G.I. Joe, and I like writing action-filled stories lends itself to G.I. Joe. But I think that I don't know, but I imagine Larry Hama suggested me to Devil's Due because he knew I'd do the homework. He knew I cared about the property and I wouldn't mess it up. So I'm pretty sure he recommended me.
Well, I had a feeling Larry was involved in you getting G.I. Joe at some point when I realized that he had hired you on Conan back in the day. So any of this stuff that you would like to talk about that I gave the Cliff Notes version of, because there's no way for me to cover every single thing that you've done in.
No, we'd be here all day.
Yeah. So, how was it working for Larry? Was he as tough as he seems? Because he's a tough guy now.
Yeah, well, Larry's always tough, real tough at the beginning. when he was an editor at Marvel, he had his test of fire that you had to go through with him. And he would generally be really nasty to newcomer freelancers that he didn't know. So if you were an artist or a writer and you were pitching stuff to him, he was just unforgiving. I mean, even brutal. I knew that ahead of time going in because an artist friend of mine, Hillary Barta, warned me about Larry. I knew Larry from his work, but I didn't know anything about Larry personally. And he warned me. He said, if you're going to pitch to him, and I wanted to pitch to him for Savage Tales, he said, be ready because he's going to really pound on you. He's going to give you a hard time. And the point of Larry, he's never told me this, but I imagine the point of him doing that was to see what you did under pressure. And if he gave you a hard time and you just went away and cried and never came back, then he didn't want to work with you. If he gave you a hard time and you gave him a hard time back and then still kept pitching, yeah, he wanted to work with you. Because then he knew if there's a deadline crunch and I really need to rely on you, you'll be there for me. Because you're one of the guys that'll tough it out. You really want this work. And so I sent him a bunch of pitches, and he bought about half of them for short stories for Savage Tales.
Wow.
And then, it was almost a year later, he asked me to come up for lunch. And that's when he gave me the lead feature on Savage Sword of Conan, which I had been pestering him about for a year. I kept pitching and pitching stories, and he told me to stop. I already have writers. I said, yeah, but I want to write it. And, so eventually he just gave it to me as a regular title. Because at that point, I'd proved my reliability and all that. And from the very beginning, once I got through the acid test, Larry couldn't have been nicer to me and couldn't have been more helpful in the industry. He went around to every editor at Marvel and said, you should use this guy. He hands stuff in when he says he's going to hand it in. His stories make sense. His characters are likable, and he did everything he could for me. So I hats off to him. I didn't just get a break. I really got a mentor when Larry started buying my stuff.
Well, it's an interesting take on that because he got a lot of help when he was getting into the industry with Toth and
Wally Wood,
Neil Adams, and so forth.
And Wally Wood. And the thing is that may be where Larry got his editorial style, because Toth, Wally Wood, and Neil Adams, they're all prickly pears, man. They weren't always the easiest guys to get along with. And I think Larry sort of picked up and said, hey, this is how I'm going to run things when I'm a boss.
And that's true. I've heard interviews where he said they gave him the hard heel on the back of the neck, and he was stuck to those tables.
He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. Yeah, I mean, he always tells that story where he asked Wally, what do you think of this drawing? You never tell me what you think. And he goes, I'll tell you when you don't suck anymore.
Yeah, I remember that story. I've heard that a couple of times. You're right about that.
Yeah, Larry's a trip. He's one of my favorite people in the whole world. So,
well, he's one of my favorite people too, actually. Yeah. So why comics? Why was that your go-to medium, and why that type of work? Why did you want to be a writer?
Well, when I was a kid, I drew. We all drew crayons. I draw my own superheroes. I trace Spider-Man covers. I try to draw my own comics. And of course, to do that, I had to come up with stories. And when I was in elementary school, the teacher gave us an assignment. She said, take a picture out of this box. She had clipped photographs out of magazines. Take a picture out of this box and write a story. And everybody had to take a picture. And I said, well, can I have more than one? She said, well, you can have as many as you want. So I took 5 pictures and wrote the story. Then you had to read it in front of the class. Well, when I read mine, I got a lot of laughs. And I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. This is cool. I told a story and they liked it. So from then on, it was always thinking of stories. And then when I realized in my early 20s, I just didn't have it to be a comic book artist. I concentrated more on the writing. And really, I've never wanted to do anything else. I've never wanted to do anything else but write comics. I didn't want to write novels. I didn't want to write screenplays. I just love writing comics. I love everything about the medium.
Obviously, you had an audience that appreciated your work. So when you have someone clap or smile or laugh or whatever, adrenaline rush there, and that means, hey, I think I'm good at this. Let's continue and see how far I can go with this. These are just my students or my classmates or whatever, but
Yeah, yeah. And it seemed to me attractive instead of getting a job. Because, I mean, when I was 6 years old, I thought the milkman had the coolest job in the world because I overheard him tell my mother once that he got off work at noon. I thought, wow, this guy only works half a day. I didn't realize he got up at 2 a.m. I thought, I want to be a milkman. So I wanted a job where I didn't have to work a lot. So, but consequently, I got a job and I worked my butt off all this time.
Well, it paid though. Look where you are now.
I've been able to get all these crazy ideas out of my head and share them with everybody. So it's I have no complaints. I'm the luckiest guy in the world.
And I'm sure you've been inspiring other kids like yourself to become comic book writers, even though it's a much more difficult thing to get into nowadays than it was when you were in there. I imagine, but
it's difficult in some ways. It's easier in others because you have the internet. I mean, you can create comics. Nobody can stop you now, and put them out there. But it's harder to get into the publishers. But in a lot of cases, you don't have to do that anymore. I mean, I don't work with any like traditional publishers anymore. I literally get up in the morning and say, what do I want to write today? Not, oh, I got to call an editor. I got to get an assignment. What do they need? When do they need it? I write what I feel like writing. So if I want to work on my novel this week, I'll work on it. If I want to catch up on my episodes of Arc Tunes, I'll do that for a week. It's all, it's the sweet spot for me. It's beautiful.
Well, you had to work a long time to get to that point, though.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, as a guy once told me, he said he had a job that I thought was so cool. I said, man, you got the coolest job in the world. And he goes, well, I had to work a lot of uncool jobs before I got here.
That's it. That's exactly it. You got that one. So is there anything else in your bio? You worked with Paul Galaxy, which I believe is a good friend of yours.
Well, I don't know. I don't really know Paul. I've never met him.
Oh, you haven't?
We like each other. We appreciate each other's work. So, I mean, he's not a frequent collaborator, but I always love working with him. A lot of the guys they do work with are close friends. I mean, Graham Nolan and Sergio Cariello and guys like that, are close friends.
From Corello was from CrossGen?
Yeah, he worked at CrossGen, but we worked at DC together on a couple of Batman crossovers. And we live near each. We live like 20 minutes apart. So consequently, I only see him like twice a year because we're both so busy.
Isn't that the case? You have your family like right down the road and you never see them.
Exactly. It's like if you grew up in New York City, you've never been to the top of the Empire State Building.
Yeah. So you worked on a lot of prolific, well, I shouldn't say prolific, major properties. Right. Punisher, Moon Knight. You did licensing stuff. What was that?
Batman.
Oh, Batman. I didn't get to that point, but I was going to. And you did a lot of licensing stuff too.
Yeah.
What led you to some of these projects? Is the work that led you needed to be hired, or is it something you had an interest in? Obviously, Punisher is kind of like the war stuff that you have an interest in that, and some of the Batman background had to do with weapons and things like that. But a lot of this other stuff, it seems interesting and unique in its own, like Airboy, Evangeline. That doesn't seem like you. I've known you for a very long time, and I didn't know you did Airboy or Evangeline.
Well, Airboy, I ran across Airboy when Jim Steranko wrote a history of the comics. And he wrote these very evocative essays about the Golden Age characters. And he really got me interested in Airboy. He had nothing but wonderful things to say about Airboy. It just sounded like this insane comic book. And the thing about Airboy was so popular when he was published, he sold as well as Batman and Superman.
Wow.
And so Golden Age issues weren't that hard to find, used bookstores and stuff, because there were millions of them out there. And I could buy a Golden Age comic of Airboy for about $2. So I was buying Airboys, any Airboys I could find, reading them and really digging them. And then one day, I'm I'm visiting Tim Truman, the artist, and he was working for Eclipse. And Eclipse calls him and says they're thinking about doing an Airboy comic. And he says it out loud, Airboy. And I went, whoa, Airboy. And so they're talking to him and everything else. And I said, he told him, he said, Chuck Dixon's right here with me. And he's this huge fan of Airboy. I mean, he knows everything about Airboy. So they put me on the phone. And by the end of the phone call, I had the job as the writer.
Wow.
So, because I was already interested in it, That
was kind of a luck, right? At the
oh
right
yeah,
place,
yeah,
right?
that was luck. Because if I wasn't there, it probably wouldn't have happened. But because they were just thinking about doing it, and I kind of like my enthusiasm, I guess, was contagious, and they got all excited about it too. So, but I mean, the thing is, I mean, I never specialized in comics. I never just did superheroes or just did horror,
right,
because I love the medium.
Right.
If you give me any story, I can translate it into comics, and so that's why I could work on SpongeBob SquarePants or The Simpsons or Conan or, whatever came along, as long as I was interested in it and was conversant with it. But you're right. I mean, I had an interest in the military stuff, but for Batman, I have a really keen interest in police procedures and mysteries based on actual science and police procedure. So, I had a background of knowledge, a head full of trivia about that stuff when I went into Batman.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that about you.
Yeah.
I learn stuff all the time. Every time I interview you, I learn more about you. Where I came to know you most, or I should say most, but first was Alien Legion, Carl Potts' Alien Legion. That was a very unique series in and of itself. And that's not in your normal wheel bag. I think Alien Legion was way out there for your normal style and the type of things you did. But like you said, you've written all kinds of things, and you can write a story. Doesn't matter what it is. So is that the case there? I
mean, Alien Legion, I mean, throughout the 60s and 70s, I was a compulsive science fiction reader. I mean, I just read tons of science fiction novels. I kind of got out of the habit, but, I must have read hundreds of them. So I kind of was conversant with that genre, and Archie Goodwin is the one who suggested me to Carl Potts, because Archie had read Airboy, which is the same way I got Robin. Denny O'Neil had read Airboy. So Airboy was really a big deal for me in my career, because these editors were reading it, because they were older and they remembered Airboy. So when the comps would come to the offices, they'd see Airboy. I haven't seen Airboy comics since I was a kid, and then they would read it. And so I, did a lot for me. So Carl took me on and just gave me, carte blanche. He was really hands off, considering that he owned the property, but he liked what I did. And every time an Alien Legion comics project comes up, he calls me. So, and I say yes.
Well, you're probably, I would say, the definitive writer in Alien Legion, going back 30 years.
I've written more of it than anybody else, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I loved them. I thought they were fantastic, and really, you did a great job on those. And it's one of my favorite things that you've written over the years.
Well, they were so well established as characters, it wasn't hard to just jump right in. It's a tremendous cast of characters. And then I added to it, of course, because I couldn't resist.
Well, speaking of adding characters, you are co-creator of one of the biggest, I don't know if it's the right term, biggest, but one of the most interesting Batman villains, Bane.
Yeah. I mean, all those action figures behind me are Bane. two shelves full of little Banes.
But there was no way for you to know that character could have become what it's become now, that it's been in movies, TV shows.
No, but Graham and I worked hard on it, because we were thinking about Nightfall. We were thinking about the Nightfall storyline. And, Superman had just died. He'd been killed. And he had been killed by a character who most people can't even remember the name of the character that killed him.
Doomsday.
Okay, there you go. And so Denny said, we've got to come out of this with a villain with legs, a villain that people will respond to and remember, and he's going to be interesting and everything else. And that's where it got started. And I made such a fuss about the fact that, how do you purposely create a character to work? Because usually in comics, we just throw it against the wall and see if it sticks. But this time it had to work. And I complained and fussed so much that Denny just said, go home and create it. Because it sounds like you're the one that's going to put all the sweat into it. So I went home and I knew Graham was going to be the first one to draw him. That's all I knew, other than he had to be smart and tough and big and be able to break Batman's back. And I called Graham and we just started talking. And I was talking out loud, just throwing thoughts out there. And he was talking about what he would look like and everything. And it just came together. And, we were really happy when he did click. Readers responded to him. Nightfall was an enormous success for DC, and Bane was a big part of it. And we thought, okay, well, that's it. That was fun. But then he kept getting used in cartoons, movies, toys, TV, and he's everywhere now, and everyone knows who he is. So it's I still can't get my head around it.
He's not as well known as Joker, obviously, but he is a major.
No,
major
obviously
character.
not. But I mean, you put your hand over your face like that and do the funny voice, everybody knows. And I hear him referenced all the time. I was watching the news the other night and they made a Bane reference. So it's like, wow.
So it's in the zeitgeist, as they would say.
There you go. That's where you want to be. That's where the money is, the zeitgeist.
You've got to be getting some residuals for that too. DC,
DC
about that.
Yeah, this was back when DC was still signing pretty decent participation agreements. So yeah, but all I gotta do, all I gotta say is God bless Lego, because they use Bane all the time. So
wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, they dig Bane. They stick him into every game, even if it doesn't make sense. And they had an outer space DC game, and they managed to get Bane in there.
Holy cow!
Yeah.
So you were asked by Denny O'Neil to do the new Robin. Basically,
Right.
That character did exist. Tim Drake did exist, but it was kind of like the second Robin, Jason Todd. He was there before, but then someone turned him into Robin, just like you turned Tim Drake into Robin, and he got his first miniseries, and you got to work with Tom Lyle again. That was a very good miniseries, in my opinion. Like I said, that's my Robin. And they've changed the character a lot nowadays. He's called the Drake. He's now bisexual. There's a lot going on with the character.
Yeah. He wears his shoes on the wrong feet. They just want to change everything.
Well, you've been in comics a long time. You got to keep working on these characters.
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing you can do.
Nothing stands still. I mean, I realize that. It's got to change. My only argument is, are the changes you making it more successful? And I argue that a lot of these changes don't make these things more successful. They're just change for the sake of change.
So was that a character in a story that you got some passion for, legs for?
Yeah. I mean,
miniseries.
I had been following Alan Grant's run on the Batman titles, prior to even ever thinking I might work on Batman characters. And so I knew who Tim Drake was, and I realized Marv Wolfman created him, but Alan really brought him along and developed him. And then when I, pretty much out of the blue, Denny O'Neil called me, said he wanted to meet with me to talk about writing a Robin miniseries. I was like, whoa, and then it was just talking with him. We spent a whole day together because I never say yes to a job immediately. I mean, even a plum. I'd never worked at DC before, but I never say yes right away because I need time to think about it. Is this something I could do my best work on? Is this something maybe another writer would be better for? Is this something I could commit to? And by the end of the day, Denny had me completely sold on it, that I was the right guy, because he liked how I wrote Airboy. He liked how I wrote a young character, because Airboy isn't trying to be hip. He's not Peter Parker as written by Stan Lee when Romita was on it. He's not talking like a Las Vegas lounge lizard, using all the latest, phrases, and he liked that. And he wanted Tim Drake to be that, to be timeless. So, and then that was the beginning of a tremendous professional relationship for me with Denny. So,
well, that was a successful attempt, obviously, on your part, because they did 2 miniseries afterwards. And then that Robin went for 100 issues in his own series after that.
It wasn't written by me. He went on longer than that, but I wrote the first 100 issues. Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, obviously I liked the character. I was really into it. I mean, I created a whole world for him, of supporting characters and all the rest of it. I mean, I dug that kind of world building.
That's where Stephanie Brown comes into things.
Yep.
She's now got her own legs, and she's doing some incredible things, which I never thought. I thought that was a throwaway character. Oh, she's just going to be his girlfriend. Oh, now she's Robin. Oh, now she's in the Teen Titans. Now she's okay. Here we go.
Well, she was created as a plot device. I mean, it was just, she was Cluemaster's daughter. We used her in an arc, and we thought that's the end of it. I thought it was a clever idea that a supervillain's daughter rebels against him. Of course, what does she become? A crime fighter, and she calls herself the spoiler because she's spoiling all of his crimes. And we thought that was the end of it. And then the letters, this is back when we used to get letters just pouring in. When are we going to see her again? Not are we going to see her again, but when? And I thought, whoa, we got to bring this character out. So then I had to start thinking about more depth to the character and what was her background like and more about her personality. But I of all the characters I've ever written or ever created, I have most affinity for Stephanie Brown, because she seems alive in my head.
Well, and that's an interesting thing that you say, because do you think back to that period and say, I must be doing something right here? Obviously, there's a response. People like my writing. That's one thing, but they're pulling these characters out and they're making these characters bigger than the characters they are a part of. Kind of like Mary Jane Watson is almost bigger than Spider-Man. Not obviously, but she was huge for a period of time. Mary Jane Watson. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's going to make you think in the back of your head, what am I doing? I obviously must be hitting a chord with somebody here.
Well, it all begins with a word I love. It's earnestness. I don't take myself very seriously, but I take my work very seriously, even though it's this silly funny book business. Because I took it real seriously when I was a kid. I mean, I lived in Peter Parker's world. I mean, and so I knew how serious readers take it, and so I have to take it just as seriously. And I always put the work in. I just to make these characters as appealing as possible, to make their emotions as honest as I could make them. I when I was writing superheroes for the big two, I always kept in mind my dream reader was a precocious 10-year-old. A 10-year-old is probably, he's the best reader in their class, and he's a whiz at everything. And I always pictured this kid, this imaginary kid. So, and that would always remind me, never pander, because I wrote children's books before I was in comics for a little while. And children, and to me, everything in superheroes, even if adults are reading them, I'm still writing them toward that precocious 10-year-old. And because children are their harshest critics. Streaming services prove this. Adults will sit and watch the most tedious, boring stuff. They'll just get in a zen and just watch. Kids won't do that. If kids get bored, they'll let you know. This story sucks. This is going nowhere. I'm not interested anymore. I'm going in the other room and play, or I'm going outside. So I knew, it's not, they don't have a short attention span. Kids, that's a misnomer. They don't have a short attention span, but they don't suffer tedium. So I knew, look, if I'm going to entertain these kids, I got to give them a story that makes sense and excites them and has lots of emotional catharsis and interesting, appealing characters and stuff like that. And I just got to pour as much of that in there as I can. So I just poured myself into these stories. And the fact that a lot of these characters have legs or become something else, well, that's the end result of all of that, because they had a foundation going in that I worked hard to build.
I agree with you 100%, because obviously I had to start someplace. I started reading G.I. Joe comics and then The Punisher, which is the two weirdest comics in NAM. 3 weirdest comics that you would think a precocious 8 or 10-year-old or whatever you want to call it would get into military comics. And I went the opposite got military, and then went into superheroes instead of superheroes into military. And it was because of the folks like yourself, Larry Hama, the people writing these characters were writing intellectually to us. They weren't dumbing it down. They weren't, doing stuff to make us think, oh, this is crap. Let's go outside, whatever. Right. And that's the truth. Any good writer worth their salt can do what you just did or said.
Yeah, I mean, there's never. I mean, if you go, well, kids, the kids are dumb. They'll buy anything. No, they won't. They're tough, man. Try writing a little golden book. I've written one. I say you got to be freaking Ernest Hemingway to keep something like that going. Keep it interesting, because you're within this narrow parameter of what you can do. And comics the same way. I mean, we pushed the envelope on the Nom. We pushed the envelope on Punisher as to what we could do in a code comic. Yeah. And we weren't trying to be subversive or or whatever. It's just we were trying to do work that was evocative and interesting and engaging. And I'm glad to hear that even at your young age, you found it to be something worth reading.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the thing about some of that stuff, now they kind of broke the comic book code. Now there's no comic book code to my understanding of when it was when I was a kid. Imagine trying to write Punisher now. Boy, is he a mess.
Yeah,
he's all over the place.
Yes. Yeah, it's a different world.
So you did all this work in DC that you're considered the most prolific comic book author in the history of comics. DC, you had to own DC Universe in the 90s. You really did.
Well, I was certainly the go-to guy in the Batman offices. Whenever anything came up, they turned to me. And I generally said yes. But almost always said yes. And then I was always generating my own projects. But I was kind of, if you look at my work at DC, it's almost 90% in the Bat office. So I didn't really own the company, because I wasn't out there in the mainstream Justice League universe all the time. Same thing at Marvel. I was doing Punisher. So I wasn't considered mainstream Marvel. They were never going to offer me the Avengers or anything like that. I was considered like a sideshow guy. I mean, and the thing is, if you worked with Larry, you were considered one of Larry's guys, even after Larry left. It's like, oh, you don't want to give it to him. That's one of Hama's guys,
I'm not sure if you're paying attention to the comic industry today. You probably are, but DC is basically Batman universe.
Yeah, it's all
there's like 100 books a month.
Right.
The only book I think that was probably outside the Bat family that you did for God knows how long was Green Arrow. You did that for Connor Hawk's Green Arrow for a decade at least.
And that's because it was edited within the Batman offices. Somehow Green Arrow landed in the Bat. I guess because he didn't have a real superpower, so they just gave him to Denny, who gave him to Scott Peterson to edit, and so he was considered like unofficial. And we crossed over all the time with the Batman characters. So
you were basically the writer for all what they consider the ground level DC universe, the whole ground level DC. You were that guy, the writer for that.
Yeah, Birds of Prey, all of them. If they were, if they had black superpowers, then they were basically dealing with, a lesser brand of supervillain. More detective work, stuff like that. Yeah, that was me. So martial arts, all that stuff.
That's a series you didn't write, but man, talking to you now, I wish you had was the GCPD. Boy, that would be something.
Well, I did two miniseries. I did a Gordon's Law and I did a GCPD mini. Two minis. So
you're right.
I was always pitching to do that kind of stuff. And of course I had a lot of police stuff in the Batman comics. I mean, I did that Bullock's Law one shot.
That's right.
Stuff like that because I love that stuff. All that stuff.
That stuff's very popular today. There's the Gotham TV show was heavily GCPD.
Right.
I wouldn't. Well, I got to be careful what I say, but I wouldn't.
I wouldn't recommend it either.
Yeah.
Yeah. My problem when people go to write the crime stuff, I'll tell you when they did Batman Black and White. Remember the Batman Black and White series? They didn't ask me to work on it, and then toward the end of it. Mark Chiarello, the editor, called me and said, could you write a Batman Black and White story? And we need it quickly. And Jorge Zafino, friend of mine, he's going to draw it. And I said, yeah, well, what do you need? And he goes, all of these people wrote Batman stories and not one of them wrote a mystery. So there is no Batman detective in any of these stories. And he goes, I need a whodunit. And so, okay, I came up with the whodunit, and that's my problem when people go to write the crime stuff. You have to have a background in this. You have to have, figured out how mysteries work, figure out how police actually work and how they talk and stuff like that. You've got to approximate some version of reality. Because if it's two guys in masks and capes fighting on a rooftop, hey, go at it. But once you start bringing the cops in, that's real world, and it's got to feel real. So you got to know cops, talk to cops, read about cops, and know the procedures and what works and what doesn't. Little stuff like there's no DNA in human urine. I mean, stuff like that. And I see that all the time. There's urine. Oh, yeah, we'll get the DNA off. No, you won't. There's none in there. It's sterile. But little stuff like that. I mean, like the Batman mystery that I wrote relied on the fact that I read something somewhere where if you freeze human flesh, it shrinks a little, and the whole mystery is based on that. The flesh of the victim having been frozen.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
I love police dramas myself, and I don't know if it was from reading Batman or whatever it was, but I try to watch as much of that type of stuff as I possibly can. Now going back and watching CSI from the 15th season back from season 1, I'm like, God, that went 15 seasons? Holy moly.
If you really like cop stuff, look on Netflix for any cop drama made in France.
In France?
In France. The French do the best cop thrillers ever, and they always have. They always have. Yeah, check it. Netflix has made a lot of them in France, in French, but these terrific cop thrillers.
Cool. I will check that out. Thank you.
Sure.
So that brings you to my wonderful state of Florida. You got dragged here by CrossGen and Mark Alessi, and I know you were being
flown first class, actually.
It was what?
Flown first class, actually.
Flown first class, but I know your feet were dragging every bit of the way. You did not want to come to Florida, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, they kept asking me. First they kept stealing my artists, and bringing them down here. Yeah, Greg Land, Butch Geis. I mean, I couldn't keep anybody on Birds of Prey. They kept getting hired away to CrossGen. So they finally approached me at a con. They sent some guys, a writer and an artist I knew, to sort of like brace me, and say, why don't you just come down and take a look, and that's okay, I said, I only fly first class. I thought that would discourage them. No, I was no problem. So they flew me down. I get to my hotel room, and there's all these comic books, this huge food basket, and this note signed by everybody in the company. Welcome, Chuck. I'm like, whoa, this is cool. So the first day, they just sort of show me around, and man, I'm blown away. It's this really nice facility, and all the artists and the colorists, the inkers, and the writers have their own offices, and everything for production is there. The letterers, everything you need to create comic books is there. And it's in this really, nice, welcoming environment. And then I knew 3/4 of the guys in the building. I had worked with all of them. And so the end of the day, they finally had me meet Mark Alessi, the owner. And he tells me the deal he's offering him, and I'm telling him, no, I need this much. So we went back and forth a little. And I told him, I said, look, if you're hiring me, you're not getting an employee, you're getting a partner. Because I said, I like what you're doing, and I want to help you do it. So Mark, another prickly pear, he hired me. I finally signed a contract, and the thing is, he tried to get me down on price, and I said, I have an exclusive contract that I have not yet signed with DC, which they had given me a couple of weeks before, and I had it in my pocket, so I was able to show him what they were offering. And I said, but I'm willing to take a pay cut to come here because I really wasn't happy at DC at the time. So I took the job, came down, and been in Florida ever since.
And that's where we got to meet for the first time.
Yep.
And you didn't get to make it to that first MegaCon where they, I shouldn't say that first, your first MegaCon, because something happened to you that year and you weren't able to make it, but they had everybody else from CrossGen there. You were just moving or something? There was some thing where all your furniture didn't show up or something. I can't remember exactly.
No, I don't know. I don't remember missing one because I know I was at the one because I got hired in September of 2001 and I didn't have to show up till March.
And MegaCon's usually in February or March.
Yeah, I think I got down here after MegaCon.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really part of CrossGen yet.
Right.
You know, I wasn't receiving a paycheck yet. But I was already working for them. I'd already started my work on Sigil and Crux and Way of the Rat before and they were paying me a page rate until I got there. So, but they allowed me to basically give DC 6 months notice. So even when I was at CrossGen for a few months, I was still writing for DC. Because I told DC, look, I'm going to leave on this issue on Robin and this issue on Birds of Prey and this issue on Nightwing. And it was a 6 month notice. So, and I heard later that my editor at DC at the time, this is long after Denny O'Neil had left, my editor at DC at the time claimed he didn't like the way I left DC because I never came up and had a final meeting with them. And I thought, well, look, I gave you 6 months notice. And the date of my final meeting at DC, where I was going to go up and meet with them the last time, was September 12th, 2001. So there was no getting in the city on that day. I had a good reason to call and cancel. I couldn't even call and cancel because the phone lines were down. So, but a little aside about how the comic book business works sometimes.
Well, and that's what this is all about. I want to know the insides and outsides of everything for your background and stuff, so people can know that you've worked in the trenches for a very long time and you know what you're talking about. And you worked for many publishers over the decades that I know you've worked in the comic industry and stuff like that. So if there's anybody that can write a tell-all about these companies.
Oh, yeah, it's never going to be me. And the thing is, I never got into the gossip and office politics. There's a lot of stuff went on I didn't know anything about. I was oblivious to. I just know, when I was treated well and when I wasn't.
I guess that makes sense, and that's the end all and be all of it, right?
That's part of the reason I'm still here is I didn't get involved in all that stuff. Because a lot of guys they get in and it's schmoozing and going to parties and social stuff. And it's like, that was never me. It's like, I'm just going to get myself in trouble. I'm staying home and writing. I'm keeping my nose to the keyboard, and that's all I'm going to do.
That's why you're writing 7 books a month.
Yeah. They have no interest in seeing me at a party. They just wanted me to hand the work in.
So then I'm not exactly sure how this happened. I'm getting differing points of view on this. You went into Devil's Due G.I. Joe, and you started up on the Reloaded, the end of Reloaded.
Right.
But I'm hearing that you got into, maybe it was IDW, through a Free Comic Book Day Transformers Revolution tie-in comic is how you got into G.I. Joe. Can you clarify that?
At IDW?
I'm not sure if it was IDW or Devil's Due where that happened.
Devil's Due, I think they were just looking for somebody to write it. And I don't know, but it only makes sense to me because they didn't know, they weren't that familiar with my stuff, obviously. And they asked, I think Larry Hama is the one who said, why don't you ask Chuck? I just started working for them, and it was a weird experience because as you said, their version of G.I. Joe didn't match anything, because I read all the Larry stuff. It didn't match anything I knew. And we had a lot of, there was a lot of disagreements over approach of the work. See, they didn't bother Larry. They let him write whatever he wanted because, who would bother Larry? But they kept giving me a hard time about stuff. And a lot of it almost seemed like their G.I. Joe universe was based on what toys the publisher had as a kid. Because it was such an odd choice of characters. and they didn't seem to understand a lot. I know I'm going beyond your question, but it didn't seem like they had an understanding of what these characters were about. So, but yeah, it was a weird experience. But yeah, I mean, they just straight up hired me. So
then you don't know anything about this Transformers Free Comic Book Day Revolution tie-in comic?
no, I don't know anything about that.
Okay, so then that clears that up. You had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I wouldn't write Transformers until years after that at IDW. I did a little.
Okay.
So.
And I was like, Revolution, that doesn't make sense. When I saw that and I read that, I was like, that doesn't make sense because Revolution was at the tail end of your G.I. Joe run. It was like towards the very end, right?
Yeah. I was just brought in to write some G.I. Joe, and then we parted company on it because we couldn't agree on anything. Yeah.
So they lost the license, and IDW got the license.
Yeah.
And you got to write some G.I. Joe Origins stories, a Scarlet, a Mainframe, and a Zartan story.
Yeah.
Were those reinventions of those characters? Because I know Larry is famous for writing all their biographies, and he wrote the comics he's still writing them for 40 years after now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how I got to IDW was I heard they got the license, and I knew the founders of IDW. So when I heard that, I gave them a call and said, "Look, if you need help," because I knew they were going to do more than one title. I said, "Look, if you need help, I know Larry's going to write the core title, and that's great. But if you need help," and they said, "No, we were going to call you. We were going to call you in a couple of days." So they called and they said, "Look, what you're going to do is a different version than Larry's, and it's like a reboot." And so I looked at, what they had suggested, and I said, "Look, I don't want to do a reboot. I don't want to change anything Larry did. I want to write those characters the way they were meant to be written." I goes, "But the advantage that we have now is that Larry didn't have, was that Larry had to introduce these toys and characters along Hasbro's schedule. And, if you know that, and I was working for Larry at the time he was doing this stuff. If you know that, his comics are even more amazing because he would just have some vehicle dumped on him and like 3 new characters. Here's a guy in a cowboy hat, and Larry would have to just create everything about those characters, made them interesting, a reason for that vehicle or weapon to be in the story. And so we weren't burdened with any of that. We had the whole G.I. Joe universe to play in. And I goes, let's just start it over. Not change anything, but just start it over. And the only conceit that I brought to it, the only thing I said is that when we start our story, G.I. Joe has no idea Cobra exists. Okay, and they know there's this terrorist thing here, and there's this military coup here, and there's a civil war going here, but they don't realize it's all because of one group, all because of one terrorist organization. And they discover this over time. And that's really it. I mean, there's no difference. All the backgrounds for the characters, I didn't change a thing, because why would you? I'm not gonna make it Chuck Dixon's G.I. Joe. It's always going to be Larry Hama's G.I. Joe.
Well, I consider it Chuck Dixon's G.I. Joe because it was the new modern interpretation of G.I. Joe. It wasn't the Larry Hama universe, in my opinion.
Right.
I read all those comics, both of them, yours and his and others. I don't consider it Larry Hama's comics.
Yeah, the core is there. The core is there. Larry's, which are beliefs I share, which are important to G.I. Joe, about honor, courage, brotherhood, fidelity, all those things. Always showing our military in a good light, as the heroes. And I got no problem with that. I was down with that. And that's what makes G.I. Joe a lasting franchise. In the end of the day, it's a war story, but it's very, very positive. It's very, very upbeat. So that's what makes it work.
So your experience.
Plus a dark, weird sense of humor Larry has.
Yeah, he does. You have one too. I read, God knows how many of your comics over the years. I know your sensibilities and things after all these years as well.
Yeah.
But working at IDW, the experience there, obviously you worked there for almost 15 years.
Right.
How was that?
They're hands off, which is the way I like it. They didn't. I can't remember a time they ever asked me for a change or said you went too far here. I don't tend to go too far anyway. I want this stuff to be all ages, universal appeal. So I'm not trying to, upset anybody or ruin anybody's day. But yeah, they're extremely hands off. They generally were on everything. Their idea was you hire people that can do the job and you just let them go. Just let them go nuts. So, every crazy idea I came up with, they were fine with. Cobra's server farms being, these big lakes of green goo, and the character Bill Docker, who I just love that character. They didn't even flinch. They just let me go.
That was something I was going to ask you about. You beat me to the punch. I guess he's a facilitator, right? Bill Docker?
Yeah, he's a scrounger. Every army unit, every military unit needs a guy that can get stuff done, even though it's not by the rules. So he was, I told the artist, make him look like Drew Carey, but he's basically Sergeant Bilko, who's a character I grew up with. And I knew it would please Larry, because I knew Larry grew up with Sergeant Bilko too. So we got a lot of affection for that Phil Silvers character. And the Scrounger character is always cool. I mean, you saw Kelly's Heroes, the Don Rickles character. Any good military story, Guys at War, is going to have that guy who can get things done.
That's one of those things, and I'm sure you've had this yourself happen to you, where you're watching something or reading something, and something just occurs to you that the writer or the people creating it will do with a character, and you're like, God, that's the most obvious moment, like the Homer Simpson moment, and you're like, yeah, we need this character. How the hell does G.I. Joe get all over the world and do all the stuff that they do? How come no one came up with that before?
Well, it's like, writers do that too. Why didn't I think of that? I used to watch the Batman animated series. Every single episode, at least once, I would go, why didn't I think of that? Because the animation guys were coming at it from a different direction. Another why didn't I think of that was when Garth Ennis took over Punisher, and he gave Punisher a cop character who was always trying to figure out catch the Punisher. It's like, why didn't I think? Nobody thought of that. All of the guys who've written Punisher, we never thought he should have a guy hunting him down all the time.
That's the thing with Punisher, though, that he was never that kind of a character in my estimation, because he was a policeman when he started out. The original Punisher was a policeman, and
Right.
So the police kind of like were friends of his or whatever. They were like, yeah, we know he's doing this stuff, but okay, we'll kind of look this way.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, as the stories became more and more outrageous, I mean, you go like, wow, federal agencies would get involved here.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy's going nuts. This guy's at war, and you can't just ignore that. You've got all these bodies piling up. Somebody's going to want to know who did that.
Yeah, when he finally goes after Dr. Doom, and you're like, wait a minute, international espionage and affairs are getting involved now.
Right.
Yeah, I guess you should call somebody.
Yeah, and I was like, I mean, Punisher grows out of that vigilante justice kind of genre. And if you've ever read, everybody's familiar with the Death Wish movie. If you ever read the novel, the end is chilling, because at the end, the character, the vigilante, has cleaned up New York so much that the crime rate drops, and he has a hard time finding criminals to go after. And he finally starts going after kids who are throwing rocks at subway cars.
What?
And he shoots a couple of them dead. And at one point, he's standing over the bodies, and he looks down the tracks, and there's a New York police officer standing there watching him. And he goes, okay, well, this is where I got to give up, right? Because I can't kill a cop. That's the same thing with Punisher. So he lays down his gun and puts his hands up, and the cop just turns around and walks away. And it's like, wow, that's a hell of an ending. That's a hell of an ending. But with the Punisher, yeah, at the beginning it was that way, but can't turn a blind eye to what all the crap he was doing.
Well, I love the Punisher. He's one of my favorite characters, and that obviously speaks a lot about my mind that I'm reading G.I. Joe, Nam, and the Punisher before Superman and Batman. But I liked realism. I like police drama. I like analytics and NCI. That type of stuff is just something that fascinates me. I don't know why, but it does.
It's real stakes. It seems real. I mean, I always pushed. They always wanted Punisher to be more fantastical, and I thought, well, the appeal of the Punisher is that it's quality of life crimes.
Yeah.
So I would have him get involved in shootouts in the drive-up lane at a fast food restaurant, or he'd go after carjackers, or my very first story, he goes after a guy who's killing taxi drivers, and
I remember that story.
Because to me, the Punisher is an adult wish fulfillment character. He's like, wow, if I could only be that. And the Punisher is the only character I think of stories for, even though I'm not paid to think of them, because you watch the news and you go, whoa, Punisher would be right in the middle of this. He'd be right there, and because that's, he's a kind of a negative wish fulfillment character, because it's like, well, if I could just murder this guy who was just a scumbag, if I could just take him out of society, and that's what the Punisher does.
And I agree with you. I see some of the things that are going on, and we're getting off track from what we're supposed to be doing here, but I'll just make this quick.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I do. I agree with you that I see those type of things. And I say, God, I wish there was a real Punisher, because this stuff needs somebody's got to do something about this. But I remember when that taxi story came out. In fact, in the comic book news fanzines and stuff like that, that was a very, I don't know what the right word is here, but like not important, but kind of a very trigger type story where people turned their heads when that story came out and said, have you read this story? Have you heard about this? Kind of like a water cooler thing, but for comic book people. I remember that story. That was a big story when that came out. I'm not sure if you remember it or not, but I was a comic book reader, and I read a lot of the fanzines and stuff like that. And that was a thing where people were like, yeah, did you see this taxi cab story with the Punisher? I said, yeah, I read that. That was incredible. Do you remember any of that?
I just remember that I pestered the hell out of Don Daly to let me write an issue of Punisher, and he finally let me do one. If you look at the record, I do one, and then a few months later another one, and then it's a long time before I do any more. But I just remember, okay, this might be my only Punisher story. So I'm boiling Frank Castle down to his essence, and he's just basically hears about cab drivers being killed, gets pissed off about it, and just says, okay, I'm going to put an end to this. It's really just a very simple story, but in it I put what I thought were Punisher trademarks. In fact, the Punisher's funny, even though he doesn't mean to be. And you take those war journal captions and you juxtapose them to what's going on in the panel. There's a lot of room for humor there because of his understatement. So I just put it all in there and hope that this would make Don Daly give me more. And of course, eventually he did. He gave me everything.
Probably because he got a lot of publicity from that story from the time that came out. But
I can assume so, but or not. But I would never know because they didn't share that kind of information.
That's strange.
I don't want you to get too swelled ahead about.
You weren't one of those guys like Todd McFarlane or Jim Lee or Rob Liefeld that were like all for that what they call movie star comic book life.
Yeah. I never wanted that. Good for them. They became millionaires off of Marvel's dime. That's great.
Yep. So IDW, back to IDW,
yeah.
G.I. Joe. So you've worked with a lot of incredible people over the years, but I consider this person your partner on your G.I. Joe, Robert Atkins.
Oh, yeah.
Incredible guy, incredible talent. He's teaching people how to be incredible talents now. At his school in can't think of the name of the school in Savannah, Georgia. SAG, I think it's called.
Geez. Yeah, I know the name. I can't remember it.
But
I think
I just saw him a couple of weeks ago at Joe Fest and did an interview with him. And I said, God, I remember the interviews with you and Chuck Dixon. It was so fun and enjoyable. It was one of my best times at conventions where I was running around doing all this stuff, and I get to talk about G.I. Joe with you and Robert or you and Chuck, and I love G.I. Joe, and I didn't know G.I. Joe Con existed at the time. When I was talking to you and all the comic book people, I was hip deep in comics. I didn't know G.I. Joe had a convention. Yeah. When I found out, I was like, oh my God, my life has changed as a G.I. Joe.
Well, here's a, I don't know if you can see that. Robert Atkins always says this is the best drawing of Snake Eyes he ever did. It's in my sketchbook.
Wow, that's beautiful.
So every once in a while he'll mention it on Facebook. Well, the best drawing I ever did of Snake Eyes is in Chuck Dixon's sketchbook. Yeah, Robert was awesome to work with. Absolutely awesome. He'd draw any crazy thing I asked him to do. He'd follow all the reference I gave him, because there's a lot of reference, and something I learned from Larry. And provide the artists with the visuals. If you ask them to draw something, give them pictures of it. And he's just, I couldn't ask for a better partner on it. And he just, I assume he was a fan, because nobody who wasn't a fan would have paid as much attention to the detail on the characters and stuff. And he gave each of them just a whole different look. I mean, different body language and everything. Just amazing.
Well, I know that he was a G.I. Joe fan of the toy line and stuff like that back in the day when he was growing. Him and his brother Brian, and that is something that he loves, G.I. Joe. And so when he had the opportunity to do something in that world, he leapt at the chance. Him and his brother both. His brother came many years later. He taught his brother how to draw. In fact.
Wow.
And that's got to be something in and of itself, to actually teach your sibling how to do something. Like, God, I want to strangle my sibling. Sorry, you didn't hear that. I'll have to cut that out. But yeah, I've interviewed the two of you before. You have a very good rapport. Obviously, you worked together off and on for a long time. Not the entire run of your G.I. Joe run, but a lot of years you worked together.
Yeah. He was the guy that brought me into it. My first jobs on G.I. Joe were all him, and it was a good collaboration. I think I don't always talk to my artists on the phone and stuff, but we talked on the phone, and we met a bunch of times at conventions. So it's just a tremendous talent. I'm very fortunate. I've always been fortunate with artists. And Robert's one of them.
I wonder if it has to do with your background and your history with the industry. People can go back and look at that, your relationships with people that you worked with, Greg Land on Birds of Prey, and different Greg Nolan, and different people. You can actually look at those and see the success of those properties because you had a marriage. In the comic book industry, it really has to be a marriage between the artist and the writer, because if you don't, all the most successful comics in history are because of a certain marriage of a writer and artist, and you know this. You guys worked very well together, from what I
always welcome collaboration. I mean, I want the artist's input, and I've been told that my script form is very easy to follow. It's very easy to draw from, because when newbie writers show me their script, and I've seen some awesome stuff from guys trying to start out. The one mistake they always make is they're really kind of namby-pamby when it comes to art direction, to panel descriptions. And I say, you got to tell the artist exactly what you want. And it's not telling him what to do. It's providing him with the information he needs. So if you say, well, I don't care if it's day or night, or I don't care if this character is a man or a woman, it's like, the artist is like, well, why do I have to decide that? He wants to be not told how to draw, but he wants to be told what to draw. And he has to understand the story as well as you do. So you've got to be very clear, very direct of what this panel needs. Not what you need, but what the panel needs to make sense. Like, I need this thing in the foreground because it's important later in the story. Stuff like that. So I've been told artists like working for my stuff because artists have requested it, which is very flattering. And then in cases like Graham Nolan or Gary Kwapis or guys like that, there's a friendship over the years, and there's a closer collaboration. And I'm not the kind of writer who looks at the script when the art comes in and compares the two. I never do that. I've had artists say, well, I added a couple of panels. I said, well, look good to me. I mean, if it works as a comic, that's all I care about, not that you slavishly followed my script. So, Frank Fosco, who I'm working with on a digital comic called Something Big, there's a lot of back and forth where he says, I think they should do this. I was like, you know what, that's great. I think that's a great idea because, you'll visually make that work. So
I think as a comic book writer, you have to be a collaborator because there is some give and take with the story, because you need the story to be obviously understandable to readers, but you want it also to illustrate what you're trying to get across in your script as well. So
right.
it is interesting collaboration like that for all three of us in that particular moment.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, in the 90s, they had this debate, and it still goes on. What's more important in a comic, the story or the art? I was like, well, they're both equally important. One isn't more important. It's like, what's more important in a song, the words or the music? I mean, that's a silly argument. We have to stop debating it because artists and writers simply have to get along. And you got to give a little on both sides.
You're right.
And you have to learn. I think trying to be a comic book artist when I was younger taught me how much goes into a page. And so I have a lot of respect for what the artist does, the time, the effort they have to put into it. And also I understand what a comic page has to look like. So when I write, I picture a page in my head. It never looks that way in the end result, but that doesn't matter. But it allows me to understand how much real estate I have on that page for words or whatever. So I'm never going to, ask an artist to do 12 panel page that includes like a space battle with thousands of spaceships. Doesn't make any sense. I want to write what makes sense for the artist without telling them to, spend all day drawing, something complicated. I wrote a panel recently and a fire escape, 6 foot tall fire escape collapses into the street. And I said, so I said to the artist, if something like this happened in real life, there'd be lots of dust, which means you don't have to draw the whole fire escape. So just throw up a lot of dust. It's more realistic and you don't have to draw a whole fire escape. So a couple of lines in the haze and you're good. And it's amazing if you look at original art, what artists get away with. It looks so detailed. And then when you look at it, the originals look real close. And wow, they really knew what not to draw. So yeah, my admiration for comic artists is, unequaled because, I work with these guys all the time and I can't believe what they do.
Was there any time during your collaboration with Robert where you guys talked about different things where he wanted to change something or you wanted him to do something different? Obviously, you said you had a good relationship. You didn't have to do that often, but was there any kind of situation?
He might have asked. Most likely with Robert, he might have asked, could you include this character? Because he wanted to draw him. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he liked Shipwreck for some reason. So I just started putting Shipwreck. I mean, we did some cool stories with Shipwreck. Because I welcome that kind of thing. It's like I always ask artists first thing is, what do you like to draw? So I can put that in. And what don't you like to draw? I was very surprised. I started a project with a top talent recently. I said, what don't you like to draw? And he says, horses. Don't write anything with horses. I hate drawing horses. I'm like, my God, you draw everything so beautifully. And no. And Rodolfo DiMaggio, when I worked with him on Green Arrow, I said, what do you like to draw? He said, attack helicopters. And I said, man, marry me. So there's no artist on earth likes throwing helicopters. Graham Nolan hates throwing helicopters. So with Robert, it was probably what characters, to put in, out of his toy box when he was a kid. So I was perfectly happy with that. I can't remember a time when, we had a disagreement over it.
I can't remember if this is true or not, but I think he said something that he had a difficult time with ordnance and weaponry and stuff like that. You would give him all these different pictures of weaponry, and he sometimes had to find other pictures or something like that. He said he had a difficult time with weaponry. I do believe in a past interview. I can't remember for a fact.
I know what he was talking about. The problem is when you give reference on a weapon, you're showing an M16 from just a flat on angle. Well, what does it look like from every other angle. I tried as much as I could to get him as many different angles on anything that I was asking him to draw. And, but yeah, I couldn't always find it. And I suggested to him a few times, go to a gun show. You know, better than that, go to a gun range and actually fire some of these things. I told him that a number of times. I said, because it'll change the way you draw them in action if you know what happens. And I remember having this conversation with him. I said, you know, when you fire a gun, particularly indoors, I said, the air pressure changes. I mean, there's smells, you know, there's lots of smoke, there's flying little bits of metal. And that was my one note to him all the time, probably drove him crazy. Show me the brass coming out of the empty brass coming out. And I think a couple of times he had to actually, at early days, had to go in white out and put in the empty cartridges coming out of the automatic weapons, because that's a bugaboo of mine. You know, it makes me nuts when I see somebody fire a machine gun. There's no brass flying, because to me that removes the believability. You know, because the brass flying is so cool. You know, and the smoke. And also another note was, you know, when you fire a gun, the smoke just doesn't come out the end of the barrel; it comes out of the action too. And if you ever see Michael Golden draw somebody firing a gun, he always does it. You know, and it looks so cool, you know, that there's smoke coming out of every orifice on this gun, because that's what happens.
I remember an annual, I think it was G.I. Joe Annual 2, and they were trying to get something off of a train or whatever it was, and he had these weapons firing, and there was stuff going by people's heads and this and that. I was like, no wonder this guy is such a sought after artist and people love him. This stuff is so realistic. It was like it was almost life, like, you know?
Yeah, well, Michael shoots a lot of guns. So he's a real gun maniac, and I am too. And it's probably not a good thing to say on the internet. But yeah, we are gun aficionados. And he's fired a lot of weapons. But I tell that to every artist I work with, if we're going to be doing something military or even, you know, Westerns or whatever. If you've never fired a gun, as an artist, you really should at least one time go to the gun range and fire a weapon, because it'll give you a completely different understanding of what they are in action. And that's what comics are, they're action.
Well, a lot of people don't know this, but I was in the police academy when I was about 30 and ended up leaving. And the way you hold a gun, up to that point, I always just thought, oh, they just gonna go like this, you know, like the Charlie's Angels, like this.
Right.
And I had to learn how to use a gun properly and where to hold it and how to hold it when you're not shooting the damn thing. And it gave me a whole new outlook on how to do that. And now in a lot of the movies and TV shows, you see them using it correctly. Up until a certain point in television and film, a lot of people didn't do that. They didn't do it right.
Well, they didn't have technical advisors like they have now.
Yeah.
And then now they listen to the technical advisors. Yeah, I know what you mean. I got a thumb that still hurts on cold nights from firing a 45 auto incorrectly. That slide came back and caught my thumb, and whoa, that hurt. That hurt. So yeah, you don't want to be doing the sideways. I mean, just look all that stuff. So I got on my website, I have a thing, 10 stupid gun mistakes every writer makes. Sort of details.
I gotta read that.
Yeah, look it up. Look it up. It's in a few places on the internet. So I think I did a video too.
Huh. So your realism in G.I. Joe was really quite striking, and the things that you I won't say illustrate because that's the artist, but the way that you told the story and stuff like that, obviously because of your background, your military historical knowledge, and I hate to say experience, but I guess experience.
Well, there's no experience. It's all books. I never served, but it's all reading and talking to vets. I talked to hundreds and hundreds of vets over my lifetime.
So that stuff was very interesting to me, because it was not, G.I. Joe was not, it wasn't done like that. Nothing against Larry Hama's stuff. He was more strictly about the story and the characters and things like that. But you were creating a level of realism and level of storytelling that I hadn't seen in G.I. Joe up until that point.
Well, Larry's stuff is gonzo, and I mean that in the most loving manner. His stuff's just gonzo. Nobody writes a better gonzo action story than Larry Hama. And that's what it was about. It's an exaggeration. Because he was, remember, when he creates his comic, he's competing with superheroes. Yeah. So he has to like kick it up a notch. So he's not really writing military thrillers. He's writing, in his own words, a grand opera. I didn't have to do that because he made G.I. Joe popular. So it was already popular, right? So I didn't have to work to make it popular. It was already what I just had to make sure I didn't screw up. And so I started writing military thrillers a bit more based in reality, as crazy as the stories were. And then getting to use a lot of stuff that I'd read about or knew, like the Cobra submarine cruiser. That was one of my favorite stories to write because most people don't even know there used to be submarine cruisers. These enormous submarines that actually had, regular battleship type guns on their main decks. And just getting to, imagine, using all my toy soldier fantasies to imagine what that would look like and what that would be, and writing a submarine story. I love submarine stories, and that was one of the most fun to work on because it was just a, reality based, but my imagination on overdrive, trying to make this thing work.
And that's what I gathered with reading a lot of your stories and stuff. I'm like, where was this prior to that? Obviously, Larry had to work within the confines of Hasbro, doing the toys and this and that. So when these companies, Devil's Due and IDW, came along, the reins were kind of gone. Like you said earlier, the reins were gone. They could do whatever the heck they wanted. There was little bits of things here and there. There was Sigma 6, there was Valor vs. Venom, Cobra vs. Joe, and then Resolute came along and Renegades. But it wasn't that much. And they didn't really follow any comic book type stuff in there. Right. You guys really had your own universe to tell unique stories. Obviously, that Costa, God, that Cobra series, probably one of the greatest stories ever of G.I. Joe. And it hurts me to say this because I loved Larry Hama's and I love your stuff. That's an incredible story with Chuckles and Jinx and all that stuff. But it meshed well with what I was doing, because he was telling like a darker, more of an espionage story, and it sort of provided a background, a gravity to what I was doing. So if you read both books, you were getting a pretty wide spectrum across the whole military thriller genre. And that's probably where the World War Cobra crossover, maybe, where you spearheaded that with Christos Cage and Costa and all them. And that thing was incredible there. How can you talk a little bit about how the development of that came about?
If I remember right, somebody came up with a general scenario. And remember, we were working pretty closely with Hasbro at this time too, because we'd have to run everything by them, and they would make suggestions, and they were always good. Of all the licensors I've ever worked with, Hasbro was the best because they actually had a dedicated full-time employee who dealt with us. They just didn't hand it to an intern or the last guy they hired, like most companies do. They actually had a dedicated person, and that's all they did, was deal with us. And but I remember on that one, I did a lot of tweaks in the scenario. I think I wrote like an 8-page treatment of how I thought it should be paced out. So that, because we weren't doing summits and stuff like that, we weren't getting to meet with each other and work these things out in person. So it was a lot of emails back and forth. And then finally I thought, like, we're getting lost here. I can't even remember what we last decided on. So let me write it down in how I understand it and then add things that we might want to think about. And I think that's basically what we worked off of. So we all knew where it began and where it ended, and who had to be where. And we didn't want a Joe character was involved. A Joe character who was imprisoned in this issue to be running around in the issue of Cobra. So it's all that kind of logistics.
Well, after your Batman work, you are obviously the king of crossovers.
Yeah.
You did tons and tons of them, so you would understand it more than
I'm
probably
a crossover whore. I love crossovers.
But G.I. Joe, that's the perfect universe to do a crossover. There's
Yeah,
no other universe that's better because you have an elite task force of military people, many different units running around doing different specialty things. Obviously, Special Missions was a popular series. You wrote that, and Larry wrote his. So that was perfect. And then you have the Cobra end of things where their interpretations of what's going on. So G.I. Joe, that's a perfect way to do crossovers because you have dozens of characters, hundreds of characters, 270 original characters, and
it's got the biggest ensemble. It's got the biggest ensemble cast of any comic property I can think of. I mean,
you guys added Devil's Due.
Yeah, we added to it.
So then, if you add the 270 original characters and then the Devil's Due characters, then your characters probably like 400 characters.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I used existing G.I. Joe characters when I could, but then things like Bill Docker would come up. It's like there's nobody. Larry didn't create anybody in the cast that does this, so I'm going to put him in. So
now that's a weird thing. Larry doesn't like to take other people's creations and put them into his run. He did have to do something with Helix, where that was something he agreed on, but that's one of the very rare exceptions.
Yeah. Larry likes to keep himself to himself, which I respect. He's got an idea of purity for that stuff, and that's cool. I mean, he's the guy. I'm not going to argue with him.
So then, Crake, Cobra Commander Crake, comes out of this crossover.
Yeah.
You have a hand in the creation of Crake?
Yeah. I kind of built him from the ground up the way I did Bane. They gave me the assignment of giving him a background and everything else. And I kind of pushed that character forward. I was the one that said, look, this guy, we haven't had a new villain here in a while. So we got to introduce somebody. And we can't be killing off characters either. We can't kill Destro or the Baroness. So we got to introduce a guy that possibly could die down the line. And they were all cool with that. And then I just sort of nudged him into the foreground and suggested we do basically a Vengeance of Bane issue #1 for him. And, they went for it. The books were selling. We were doing well. So, yeah, go ahead and do it.
And to your credit, that is my favorite version of Cobra Commander.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Thank you.
He was just real. He was a real character. I could see him coming through the ranks, getting to that position, and what he did when he was in that position and how it developed. And it felt real to me. And that's what I love about a lot of your work. It feels real. Yeah, it's Green Arrow fighting people off of a helicopter, shooting arrows. It's, Batman in the sewers fighting this guy or whatever. But the stuff feels real. You have that ability to make a person reading feel that's them. I'm Batman, or I'm Green Arrow, or I'm this person or that person in your storyline. And that is a credit to your skills. And I don't know if it's from all your previous work that you've garnered this skill and the people you've worked with that helped you garner and get to this point, but it's very good.
Well, an artist early in my career said that he liked my scripts because they were honest. He said, not realistic, because they can't be realistic, but they're honest. The people in them seem to move about and do things in response to human nature that I can recognize. And, like the creation of the new Cobra Commander, I thought, you'd have a guy who wanted to be Cobra Commander with the simple fact that he had scores to settle. And that was the driving force behind it, because we all would like that. We all have fantasies about, I'll show them, or I'll, you'll rue the day. You can't have that. You can't have that as a driving force in your life, because people say, well, I'm going to succeed to show them. Well, that's a lousy reason to succeed. Succeed because you want to succeed, because you have a goal. But we all know people who succeed because I'll show them. And they're generally not nice people. So it's a perfect groundwork for a villain and something everyone can relate to, because you're either like, hey, I'm just like that guy, or, my sister's just like that. So, so you got to base it on, relatable. I always say I'm more interested in characters who are trying to make their car payment than characters who are trying to save the universe. Because I need something to relate to.
That's true. You're right. Because then he's just like you or just like me. I have to make my car payment.
Yeah.
I get a flat tire. I got to change my tire.
He may ultimately save the universe, but I got to begin with the relatability.
And I think that's it. I didn't think about that, but I think that's it. That's what gets me with a lot of your work is, I can relate to the person, not the superheroics, but the person, the things that you have to deal with every day in life. All of us do. And that's the key to, telling a story, is to making that character. I see myself in that character. Or I see myself doing what that character is doing, or this or that. That's an interesting point. I would never have thought about. I should have thought about that, but obviously you're the writer and I'm the interviewer. So,
well, you learn a lot talking to other writers too. And in a lot of cases when you write, you have these ideas, but there's no one to articulate for you what the hell it is you're trying to do. What's a third act, a 3-act, progression, what's a denouement? What is and nobody's put these words to you. It's like, well, there's this, the story's over, but there's a little bit more story. Well, I call that a denouement. Oh, I mean, that's a thing. So when you see other writers and talk to other writers or read criticism, I always urge anyone who wants to be a writer to read a lot of criticism of books they've read and movies they've seen, because it's important to get another person's point of view on everything, and then you work that in. But yeah, I mean, it's tough when you start out because you don't have the words to describe what it is that you're trying to do. So, I mean, that's why when I first started working at DC, they paid for me to take the McKee course on story structure, because everyone at DC had taken it. And so then we all had a shared language of how to talk about the stuff.
What was that again?
It was the Robert McKee story structure course. He's ancient now. I don't know if he still gives it, but it was like a 3-day boot camp. And when I say days, I mean from the time you woke up to the time you went to bed. This guy talked about writing.
Wow.
And there's a movie called Adaptation with Nick Cage, and it's based on a screenwriter's trying to adapt a novel, and he goes and takes the McKee course.
Oh.
And McKee is brutal and horrible and shouting at people in the audience, and that's exactly what it was like.
Interesting.
But it was, but it gave me, he articulated all these things that were in my head as a writer that I'd never been able to put into words. So then I was able to actually organize those thoughts in my head, and then understand when I was doing it right or I was doing it wrong. So, but at the end of it, Denny O'Neil asked me, he said, did you get a lot out of it? And I said, yeah, I got some stuff out of it. I said, I still don't understand 3-act structure. And he said, don't worry, you do it. You do it anyway, whether you understand it or not. He says, all of your stories have it.
So I call it your run because you pretty much own the normal G.I. Joe at IDW. Got rebooted numerous times, 2 or 3 times. You ended up getting rebooted and starting into special missions, and that's where Paul Galaxy came back into your, I guess,
sphere of influence,
something. And
that's
you
when
guys,
Paul walked back in the room.
Yeah. So how is that relationship coming back together and working on G.I. Joe? Because I know I asked you this many years ago, but I'd like a fresh answer on that.
Well, I mean, working with Paul, I mean, I was a big admirer. Oh, I still am a big admirer. And he, I knew what he liked to draw. I knew what he was really good at. So you want to, and I knew he's an awesome storyteller, and also, he brings a kind of noirish feel to everything he does. It's always this chiaroscuro drawing with these heavy black shadows and stuff like that. So, a lot of nighttime scenes, a lot of scenes that are really dramatically lit by firelight. I don't think anybody does firelight better than Paul Gulacy. And even in black and white, it looks like there's firelight in the scene, and lots of really angry people. he does. I mean, he's in your face. I mean, if Paul was an actor, he'd be chewing the scenery in every appearance. But that's great for comics, because comics are such an in-your-face medium. Also, sweaty people. He does the greatest sweaty. It sounds like I'm breaking him down, like that Monty Python routine where the Shakespeare actor is only interested in how many words he has to say. But sometimes it breaks down like that, and you want to give the guy things to draw that he's really good at. I mean, Paul's good at everything, but it was just such a blast, and really a lot of the stuff with the dreadnoughts. I mean, I love that stuff that he did. I mean, those characters were made for him.
Well, obviously he loves martial arts and ninja type stuff, because he did Shang-Chi for God knows how long, right?
Yeah.
So that was like right in his wheelbasket.
Right.
But he got to do a lot of other stuff with that series.
I mean, we went kind of nuts on all of it. So, I mean, and that's the thing. He's so, amplifiers turned up to 11 all the time that, I'll feed right into that. I'll go all day long. Yeah, I'm going right with you, Paul. This story's going to be nuts from beginning to end. So,
and those were some very interesting comics. When I was reading, I'm like, what in the world? He's really going off the rails with this story. But that's good though. It is entertainment.
Well, it's an energy. You create an energy between the two of you. And we just went totally psychotronic on some of those stories.
Now, you have obviously had very good reports with a lot of your collaborators over the years. Is there any collaborators besides the ones that I've mentioned thus far that you've worked with in your run on G.I. Joe that you would like to talk about or mention?
Shannon Gallant was great.
S.L. Gallant, yes.
Yeah, I love working with him. I love his environments. Everything he drew looked like a real place. And he could keep things consistent. Because remember, we did it like an extended story that took place in Springfield. And I really wanted it to look like you believe in this town. And he was able to show like the same building from different angles. I mean, he was conscientious enough to be concerned about that. And that's great. And he drew the characters terrific. And another favorite was Will Rosado, who I just think is just totally underrated. And if you look at his stories that we did, they are as close to like as realistic military thrillers as we could make them. There's not a lot of fantastical elements in the Will Rosado stories because he was so good at drawing that real world and making it evocative and interesting. And I just love that sort of almost storyboard style that he has in his artwork.
And that's the interesting about G.I. Joe. For years before this ever even became a thing, for years, reading a lot of your work, reading a lot of the stuff that Costa was doing and Cage was doing and stuff like that, I was like, God, this is like the perfect television, like SWAT or some sort of ops type television series. I'm like, why hasn't this become a thing? Then they announced the Lady J Amazon series. Like, finally, maybe someone will get this visual of that type of thing and put it on screen, but it will be with G.I. Joe characters and not make it over the top like the two movies that we had that were just ridiculous. But I think that would just be incredible. I think you would be an incredible writer on something like that.
Because the movies, you can't just blame G.I. Joe. It's like every movie franchise has gone toward the superhero end.
Yeah.
I mean, Star Trek movies look like superhero movies.
That's true.
And they act, hell, the Fast and the Furious movies are superhero movies now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you want a more ground-based, realistic version of G.I. Joe, but, they're going to be tempted to go to the zany end because it's G.I. Joe. So, which I think is a mistake, but, when you get out to Hollywood, all the rules disappear.
Well, you can see this poster behind me.
Yeah.
I liked it. I'm one of the few people that liked it because I felt it was more realistic. They went in their own direction and stuff like that. But I don't want to get off track, but I thought it was a pretty decent movie. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I did that one. I didn't see. I saw the first two films, but I haven't seen that one yet.
I recommend it.
Okay, I'll check it out. I will check it out. It's on one of my services free right now. So
I think it's Amazon, probably.
yeah, Amazon has
Right?
it for free.
Yeah, I think you'd find it interesting.
Cool.
It's everything that I like about your work. The character development is
Oh, okay.
there. Obviously the script. There's many layers of the script and the characters, and that's all good stuff. And it's realistic, in my opinion. Of course, it's a martial arts movie that's in Japan, so
Right.
you got to put that aside. You know what you're going to get,
Right.
but everything
Right.
else. And Larry has a cameo in there.
Always good to see Larry. Always good to see Larry.
He's been in lots of stuff, actually.
Yeah. He's a man of many, many, many talents.
He is. So, was there anything where at IDW when you worked there, you said you didn't get a lot of editorial notes and stuff like that, but were there a lot of like collaborative type meetings and things that you had to get involved with? Obviously, with the Cobra World War, you had to get involved there, but a lot of the because it's a licensed property, Hasbro's involved. Were there a lot of interactions like that?
It was all pretty casual. I think if we were doing it today, it would have required dozens of Zoom calls, which would have made it intolerable. but I mean, I love talking like this, but boy, Zoom calls can get nuts or really, really dull. But it was just maybe a few phone calls now and then, mostly email exchanges. And I talked to the Hasbro people a couple of times because they were going to do a lot of other comic properties, and I was always talking to them about other stuff, or writing up treatments for possible comic adaptations of some property at Hasbro. But like I say, all of that was positive. They were very encouraging, and they really we would every once in a while I'd write something. They go, I don't know if Hasbro's going to like this. Let's run it by them before we do it, and they would go, no, go for it, go crazy. So. Yeah, and I don't remember a lot of like long extended phone conversations. It's really weird because Andy Schmidt was my editor for a long time at the beginning. I never met him, but I met his parents because I did my own G.I. Joe tour through the Midwest. I hit a different comic shop every day for a week promoting G.I. Joe, and I went through Andy's hometown, and his parents came by to meet me. It's really weird, but there wasn't, like I said, there wasn't summits. There wasn't like we all got together for 3 days in Vegas or something and talked about G.I. Joe and Cobra. So it all had to be done by phone, by email, with guys who played well together. So there wasn't any egos or pushing around or anything else. We all wanted the same end result, a compelling G.I. Joe series. Or multiple series.
And there was a period where it was fantastic. It did towards the later years of IDW. They had more difficult times, and we won't go into that. But
no, please don't.
Well, G.I. Joe is a unique thing where you can go many different places with it. And they were trying to go, I think, too far into the fantastical. When you start sending your G.I. Joes back in time to fight dinosaurs, and you have the action team from the 70s join you on an adventure in time. Yeah. As much as I enjoyed the story, I think maybe we've lost track of where we needed to be with it, and that was Scarlet, because you made her the leader of your G.I. Joe special missions, and from that point on, she was like the head of G.I. Joe for quite a while, and I think she still might be. So that development continued, and so she was on this team going back in time.
Yeah, I don't, in some of these stories, it's like when anything can happen, who cares what does? Unless you have like a really compelling reason. And the thing is, they used to resist. I mean, I suggested we do even a mini series of G.I. Joe in World War II, or the Adventure Team, not with the existing, create new characters and show how the origins of G.I. Joe. and but they always resisted it. Adventure Team, for some reason, when I was there, you couldn't even talk about Adventure Team. We even Robert, I think Robert and I, at my suggestion, Robert slipped a reference to the Adventure Team, like a visual reference in the background. They took it out.
Oh,
It was like an Easter egg. It's like, who's going to notice this? Well, they took it. They saw it. And they took it out.
that sucks.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of things when you work for these companies. There's no understanding. You know, why can't I do that? It's like when I was at DC. Every summit, all the writers would say, "We want to use the Wraith." The Wraith appeared one time in, I think, a Batman annual, and they was, "Oh no." They would never explain why.
That is strange.
We can never use why. They've never explained it. There was
I'm gonna
some
have to look
sweetheart
that up.
deal, some sweetheart deal made in the '80s, and we couldn't touch it.
Huh. I'm gonna have to look up. I'm gonna look up that character and figure out where it first appeared and see if I can figure it out, because I pretty much.
It's a great story. I think it's a Mike W. Barr story with Michael Golden art. It's a great comic, and that's why we wanted to use him. He was like the anti-Batman character. He's a perfect villain because he was like Batman. He's just as skilled, just as smart, just as tough, and never saw him again.
There's got to be some sort of inside thing there. I wonder why.
I don't know, because sometimes they would explain, I want to use this character, and then he would go, I hate that character. Okay, why do you hate that character? He's too science fiction. He hated Mr. Freeze. He hated Clayface. He hated Killer Croc. Because in my second Robin miniseries, I said I want to introduce the Joker. He needs a gang, so he kills another guy and steals his gang. And then he says, have him kill Mr. Freeze. I said, well, I wasn't even going to have him kill an established villain. He goes, no, I want Mr. Freeze dead. And then I brought Mr. Freeze back, and then he was so angry at me.
Yeah, but back to the Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's series, they made Mr. Freeze cool.
Oh, the thing is, they made a lot of characters cool that either weren't or weren't interesting. The same way the 1966 series did. Nobody gives them credit for what they did with Catwoman and the Riddler and characters like that, where they really developed them way beyond what they were in the comics. And the animated series did the same. And they made Mr. Freeze so freaking cool. And it's like, why didn't anybody ever do this? Why didn't anybody go back and say, what's wrong with Mr. Freeze? Let's fix it.
That's the unique thing about comics. That's a unique thing about this medium is you have 80 years worth of comics to go back on and change a character. The perfect example is Starman. Who would have thought that Starman could have been this phenomenal series, and all the different variations of Starman are now cool? Who wants a flamboyant 70s disco Starman character called McCall? I do, because it's a cool character now.
Well, that's it. You just have to go back and rethink it. You don't have to break the character. You can build upon them. Give them a different. Give some of these characters have no background. It's like Denny once said that he understood why Marvel succeeded over DC in the 60s. He said because the most interesting personality quirks of our characters was, oh, he's got a magic ring, or he's always late for dates with his girlfriend, even though he's the fastest man in the world. He says, and that's as much character development as they had. So you got to go back in and rebuild.
Well, I can never remember who quoted this or did this quote, but somebody said there's no such thing as a bad character. There's only such a thing as a bad writer.
Well, it's true, because you should be able to do, I kind of tried to specialize when I was on Batman, taking the lamest villains and making them work, making them be frightening or whatever. And, Denny once said to me, he said, my God, I can't believe you wrote a Calendar Man story that I liked.
Well, look where Calendar Man is now, today. People love him.
Yep. But he was lame. And Firefly is another one. My greatest regret in comics is that Graham and I didn't rename Firefly, because if we did, we would have gotten money off the toys. But we just recreated the character because he was so lame. When I was a kid, I thought he was lame. And we just sort of recreated him, and he's like one of the most frightening Batman villains of them all, and most twisted. And I was really pleased with what we did, but unfortunately, that's all. We just we get the geeky pleasure of refurbishing or reupholstering a classic character.
That's fun. I think that's a fun thing, and you did that with a lot of GI Joe characters too. Along the way, yeah, Larry did their bios and things like that, but you gave some of these characters life. Larry could only do so much in his stories, and there was characters he never even touched on. They ran through a panel, that was it, and you'd never see that character again. He killed off a whole bunch of characters and forgot that he killed them off. That's how forgettable the characters were to him, because he couldn't get all the characters into it. It was impossible. But you didn't do that. You actually gave these characters life. You gave them depth and stuff like that over the course of all the series you wrote for IDW. And I got like all the main issues here to illustrate how many different series you wrote for GI Joe. People don't probably realize that you wrote a lot of stories. I got an entire I won't say an entire, but a half box filled with just your comics.
Yeah, I was kind of the go-to guy there for a while. I mean, that's the way I usually roll. You give me a franchise, I'll write it till the wheels come off, because I just got into it. I understood the series and the characters from what Larry wrote, but then when I got an opportunity, I just lived in that world for a while. I enjoyed every minute of writing GI Joe, even though I didn't grow up with it. I was an adult when the toys came out. I had a 12-inch Joe when I was a kid, but that's about it. So, but it's I got to play in Larry's world. It was kind of cool.
Well, and I could tell you were enjoying it all the time we've talked in the past. I could tell you were enjoying the different new things that were coming up, and you would always, we got this coming up. I can't talk about too much, blah, blah, blah. But that stuff was really fun stuff. And as a shouldn't say a kid, but an adult, from a kid's point of view, seeing all these new stories, because there wasn't a lot of media, and the media that they were doing wasn't that great, other than Resolute that Garth Ennis did. A lot of it wasn't that great. I like Sigma 6. It was just a weird series, but that was it. It was your series, your comics, and IDW's comics that really kept this license alive for probably a good 10 years. I would say from 2011 till 2018 or 19, when they started to rethink it and reboot it at Hasbro. That was a good 10 years. We only had the comics. That was it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, thank you. Thank you for very kind words. I just sit here in this room and make stuff up, and I'm always happy when someone says they enjoyed it.
I wish I had the skills you do, but you obviously honed your skills over many, many years, sharpening your blade and getting better and better at it. And
I don't know how old you are, but I didn't go full-time pro till I was 32. So
wow.
And I was always inspired when I was trying to be a writer that some of my favorite writers didn't even begin writing until their 40s or their 50s. I thought, well, I got time. So,
wow. Well, obviously you were born in 1954, so that puts you pretty up there in your late 60s, I guess.
86 was the year I went pro, thanks to Larry Hama. He gave me the lead feature on Conan, and I thought, hey, I can quit my day job. So,
wow.
Yeah. I never went back to a day job again. But the idea of going back to a job is a nightmare to me. I have to be somewhere on time and do what people tell me to do. Oh, I can't do it.
Now, script development and script structure and script breakdown and stuff like that, that's the boring stuff of an interview. But for the sake of this particular interview, I'm going to try to get into it because we want to get all the nuts and bolts of the creation and how something is made for the folks that's going to come and read this stuff and say, oh, okay, Chuck knows what he's doing. He's going to talk about all this stuff. Could you talk a little bit about it for me?
Well, I mean, every writer works differently. I generally start with the big scene. If I already got my characters, you got to create the character, But I kind of create the characters as I go along if I'm creating a new character. Except Bane. Bane was a lot of thought before I put a word down. But like the submarine cruiser story in G.I. Joe, the Joes managed to get on board this enormous Cobra submarine. And I said, I want this scene where they're trapped on board and it's sinking. And they detach the conning tower, because they find out in the schematics that they're able to detach the conning tower. But even that's filling with water. So it's your classic, submarine scenario. And from there, I'm like, well, how do they get on the submarine? Why are they there and Cobra's not? And blah blah blah. And it's just basically working out the mechanics of the story. Once I have an idea of how I want things to go, and what the big scene is, now the opening is the hardest work. How is it going to open? And you always got to open big, always got to open engaging. And as Denny O'Neil taught us, treat every comic like it's someone's first comic. So those first 3 pages are the most important pages you'll write, because you got to introduce the characters, the situation, and whatever suspense scenario you have going on, to draw the reader in. Even if they're in the middle of an arc and they didn't read the previous issue, you got something going on that's going to draw them into that story and say, who are these people? Why is this happening? What are they doing? And most importantly, what's going to happen next? And that's where I begin. And the rest is all just mechanics, working out dialogue. Dialogue is something I sweat over more than anything else. And to make it believable, give it a flow, or make it funny, or whatever. Every piece of dialogue has to serve a purpose, and every scene has to serve 2 purposes. A scene that just tells you about the character, or a scene that just has 2 people fighting, boring. If the 2 people are fighting and there's something at stake or something else going on in the background, or it's funny, or we're learning something about them, that's the 2 things going on in the scene. So, the rest is all, if you want to ask about specifics, I write full script, panel descriptions, dialogue, everything's there for the artist. So
okay,
I can get more specific than that, but that's generally how I work.
Oh, that's fine.
That's my quote unquote process.
Trust me, I've heard so much about Larry's process that I could quote it word for word.
Yeah, he just starts at the beginning and goes.
Yeah, every time, every single issue. Okay.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of outlining or anything like that, but Larry is just totally seat of the pants. And that energy comes through. I think that process works for him.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but the guy knows what he's doing.
Well, obviously he's been writing the comic for 4 years, and they're almost up to 300 now.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And they're always entertaining. The guy's never written a story that didn't at least entertain.
Yeah. Well, he understands what the audience is looking for, what he wants out of the story, and the characters. He knows the characters better than anybody else. So with those 3 things in mind, you're going to get an entertaining comic. No matter if you're a brand new person, you're a seasoned person, G.I. Joe, you're going to be able to be entertained regardless.
You're also going to get, even though if you're not aware of it, a peek into Larry's worldview and psyche. If you know him and you read the comics, oh wow, that's so Larry. I've heard Larry say that. Oh yeah, that's where he would go with this story. Or that's what he would. That's the reaction. That's a Larry reaction this character's having. Yeah, it's cool stuff. It is really cool stuff.
Is there anything that you have that you can show maybe on video here that goes back to your time of G.I. Joe? You showed Robert Atkins' sketch there. Is there anything you can show that the viewers might enjoy seeing from your history of G.I. Joe, from your history with G.I. Joe, the brand?
Well, if we, okay, turn around here. I think you can see a Baroness there.
Yeah.
In the cabinet. And there's a regular standard issue Helix action figure somewhere in there. She's standing in there somewhere with the others. But that's I don't really have any I don't have any other G.I. Joe art other than that Robert Atkins.
Wow. I'm surprised.
Yeah, that's surprising. That surprises me now that I realize it, because I have other artwork from stuff I've worked on. That's the only thing I have from that series. I'm stunned that I don't have some Will Rosato pages. Well, I'll have to talk to him about that. Ask
Yeah.
him to sell some pages. So,
Um, you got the Inkpot Award in 2014 for your work. That's something to be proud of.
yeah.
With all the people that have gotten that, to put yourself in that group, it's got to be something very important.
Yeah, it's pretty funny because we got, the San Diego Comic-Con contacted me and said, we want you to come out and do a panel with Graham Nolan and Kelly Jones. And I'm like, you want me to fly to San Diego? I said, well, all expenses paid. And once again, I said, I only fly first class. I'm 6'3". I'm not flying coach. And I wasn't that interested in going. And I thought, so I thought first class, they're never going to go for that. And they did. They said, we'll fly your first class both ways. And well, let me think about it. And then Denny called me. And he says, you're coming to San Diego, right? For that panel. I'm moderating it. I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm thinking about it. You really need to come to San Diego because I'm moderating this panel. And I'm like, what's with him? It's a panel. I'm going to fly all the way to San Diego for 45 minutes. I mean, this is insane. Why is everybody wanting me out there so bad? And it really wasn't until we got there and we did the panel. I thought, okay, well, that's it. And then he says, and the Inkpot Award, and he started talking about the Inkpot Awards, and they come out and give us Inkpot, and we were stunned. We had no idea. We were like all three of us. We were, we're oblivious comic book people. We were like the dumbest game show contestant you've ever seen. We were like, what? I was like, what? I still thought it was a joke. I thought Denny's going to turn around and go, yeah, you're not getting that. Kept it a complete secret from us. I mean, if I'd thought about it for a second, it would have been, there must be some other reason they want me out there. Because who spends all that money to get a guy out to answer a few questions on a panel? But yeah, I was blown away. And then Graham and I walked around the con together in our arms, with our awards in our arms, acting like we were the kings of the world. So that was fun.
Well, congratulations. You deserve it. You're an incredible writer, and you've done a lot of work that's resonated with me, and I know you resonated with a lot of other fans and people in the world from your characters and your creations and stories and stuff like that. So
it's all been fun. It hasn't been work. It's all been fun.
If that's what you get out of it. That's the main thing. If you have to do something that's arduous, you have to wake up every day. Oh God, I got to get the hell up and do this. That's not fun, and that's not something you want to do.
No.
I wish everybody could aspire to doing something like that. We don't all have the choices that you probably had, but that's just the way life is.
Well, like I said, I worked a lot of crappy jobs too.
So, in closing, is there anything you would like to say to the fans out there of G.I. Joe and comic books in general before we close this out?
Thanks for all the support. I mean, just know that, I'm as big a geek behind the keyboard as you are, watching this. I mean, I'm, as my wife reminds me, just a, 100% nerd about this stuff. I just love it. I've always loved it. My enthusiasm is as high now as the first assignment I got in comics. I look forward to, as I get older, writing is more and more of a compulsion. And people talk about, I can't wait for the weekend. I'm like, oh, the weekend? I can't work. It's the weekend. I love my family, but it's like, wow, I really wish I was writing.
That's something.
It's weird. I mean, I was talking with Mike Barron about it the other day. The older you get, the more of a compulsion this becomes.
Sounds like you have an affliction, a writing affliction.
Yeah, I got a problem. I really, someday I got to take like 2 weeks off from it. But I'll probably just be making notes the whole time.
I do the same thing. You're sleeping or you're driving or you're doing this, and you're like, God, that's a cool word. Let me write that word down. Or that's an interesting phrase you hear in a movie, or you hear in a TV show, or you hear somebody say something at work or this or that. You're like, hey, that's interesting. Let me write that down. I do that all the time. I wish I had some place to put all that, but I don't.
I think every time I'm at Target in line behind people at the register, I wish I had a recorder on me. You hear these conversations like, God, I got to use that. I have got to use that. That is such a weird turn of phrase this person just used.
So thank you very much for taking the opportunity and giving me the opportunity, I should say, and taking your time out of your schedule, busy schedule, obviously, because you're writing novels like crazy, to speak with us and speak with the fans. And this is going to go on the 3D Joe's website for everybody to see for
Cool.
posterity. Hopefully the 3D's website will stay there forever.
We can hope. Until the solar flare comes, it'll be there.
So
but no, thanks for having me. This was fun. This is, I love talking about this stuff, especially with someone who's knowledgeable and gets it. So
thank you very much.
Yeah.
I try. I did do my research. I got my papers here with research.
Oh, very good. Always good to do the homework.
So thank you again. And I will see you in the Funny Books, I guess.
Yeah, or at a show somewhere in the future.
I hope to get you to come to Joe Fest. Ed, the guy that runs the show, said you would be flown out, whatever you wanted, anything you wanted. It's the red carpet for you, he said.
Well, next year, not this year, but next year.
Okay. Well, this year just went by like 2 weeks ago. So.
Well, then definitely not this year, unless we get that time machine we were talking about.
Well, that's true. So then definitely, I'm going to be in touch with you to try and get that arranged for next year.
Okay. All right. Sounds great. All right.
All right, then. I'm going to close this out. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it.